Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about, in this global political challenge, about how will Brexit affect Britain's soft power. So, first of all, when I talk about Brexit, I'm going to be talking specifically about the decision to leave the European Union, not the recent trade deal that Britain negotiated. So I'm going to be looking at the decision to leave the European Union, which happened in June 2016. This comes under, I think, the identity section of the global political challenge. You could also argue it's to do with borders, but I'm really sort of looking at this as how's it going to affect Britain's identity. The key concepts I'm going to be looking at here, power, obviously soft power specifically, also sovereignty. I'm going to be looking at the theoretical foundation of liberalism. And I think that this is a really unique event, Brexit, because possibly some have said it's going to signal the end of globalization, sort of the end of this idea of global governance. And it does seem to be part of a bigger global trend, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later. I'm going to look at three perspectives. The first perspective, I'm going to look at the perspective of the British government and what they think about whether this is going to damage their soft power. I'm going to look at the perspective of the British people. And last but not least, I'm going to look at the perspective of the countries inside the European Union and the European Union as a whole. So I'm looking at sort of a national and a regional level. So first of all, the British government. So the current British government is conservative. They, as a party, were largely pro-Brexit, including the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And obviously, Boris Johnson was one of the main campaigners for the Leave vote in the referendum. And the Conservative Party and the Leave Party were backed by two of the biggest tabloid newspapers in the United Kingdom, the Daily Mail and the Sun. And here we can see some examples of the headlines on the day of the referendum results and the day of the vote itself. And you can see, obviously, the Daily Mail goes with "Take a Bow, Britain," and the Sun goes with "Our time has come." These are obviously both very pro-Brexit. And the angle they sort of spun was that this would increase British sovereignty because it would be taking back control from Brussels. And in terms of soft power, in the aftermath of Brexit, you had, once it became clear that Brexit was probably going to be quite damaging, the issue of a second referendum that no political party was prepared to push, even Labour, the opposition. And this was seen as very damaging to Britain's soft power because the amount of political infighting. Now, the Remainers, those who, especially in the Labour Party, were against Brexit, have said repeatedly this will be bad for soft power. But it's interesting that since the Brexit decision, Britain has substantially increased its military budget, implying that the British government is aware that their soft power will decrease, so is replacing it with hard power. Now, the British population in 2016 voted by a margin of 52 to 48 to leave the European Union. Now, this is a poll taken in December 2020, which says, in hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to leave the European Union? And the majority here, close to 50%, say yes, we were wrong to leave the European Union, whereas less than 40% think that is right. So obviously in the last 4 years, Britain's prestige and its soft power has been damaged. Now, this is also related to the 56% rise in racist hate crimes in Britain since June 2016, which many political commentators have said is a result of the Brexit vote. this has been particularly damaging for Britain's soft power, especially in Asian countries where lots of Asian tourists normally would visit. You've also had a number of major companies leaving the UK in the last 4 years and moving their headquarters to mainland Europe, such as Dyson, Honda, HSBC, Ford, and Barclays. Now, this is particularly bad for British soft power because this directly means that Britain is no longer a place where it's desirable to set up a business, because it's so much easier and cheaper to do it in the EU. And so all of this seems to suggest that the British public is aware that Britain's soft power has been damaged. But what's interesting is the same poll also asked, what would you vote if you had a new EU referendum? And still 50% say stay out, and less than 50% say apply to rejoin. So it's almost like the British public thinks the damage is already done, the damage to its soft power is done, regardless of what actually happens in the future. Next, we're going to look at the European Union and what they think of Brexit. And so Europe is largely pro-EU membership. If we look at this table here, we can see that, generally speaking, the vast majority of EU members are very positively pro-European. And some people have said, well, this is because Britain is an island and it historically has been separate from Europe, although I would argue that Ireland at the top here would probably refute that. But generally speaking, they still believe in the idea of EU membership, in the idea of liberalization, people working together. And as we can see down the bottom here, we obviously have the UK, and we have Norway and Switzerland that are not part of the EU, although they do have certain trade deals. What's interesting is that in 2015, Britain was voted as #1 in the Soft Power 30 rankings, and Britain slipped to #2 around 2018. Now, what's interesting is you would think there would be a more drastic slip, but the actual effects of Brexit in terms of legislation haven't happened yet. So even at this time of recording in January 2021, the full-term effects we don't really know yet. But things like the cancelling of the Erasmus program, which brought in hundreds of thousands of European students, and vice versa, have been cancelled. And the European view also tends to be that Britain's soft power is damaged because America, that was meant to be Britain's go-to friend, is also looking particularly illegitimate and uncertain these days. So in conclusion, it's interesting and important to see Brexit as part of the wider global context, which is a rise of nationalism, which is a rise of populism and the far right. And we saw this in America with Donald Trump's election, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in India. So generally, leaders and countries are starting to move away from globalization and have an increasing importance in nationalism and sovereignty. And some people have said, is this the end of globalization? Has the great globalization, has the great liberalization experiment failed? Is the EU still relevant? Is the UN still relevant? There's an increasing number of countries, minorities, but still an increasing number within the EU, such as the Netherlands, who want to have a referendum on it. And if we see with the obviously recent pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, faith in organizations such as the WHO to deal with it, so the faith in intergovernmental organizations to deal with these things is diminished. So what does this teach us? Well, firstly, yes, it's damaged Britain's soft power. Possibly not as much as we would have assumed, but that's because it's taken 4 years for Britain to get out of the EU. And we'll probably see a drastic decrease in Britain's soft power rankings after this. But that soft power, which is a relatively new concept, remember, is probably not as important as it was. And countries are starting to realize that they can do with reductions in soft power if it increases their own internal power. That is my GPC. Thank you very much.